Okay, so now we talk about key management, which is the last thing I will say to you about on the topic of encryption or encoding messages, the need for choosing a good password in order to protect the data that you publish on a social media platform that you decide to use. So we talk about passwords, ways that you manage your keys, because basically your password can be translated into a key, and then you need to manage this with respect to all of the different platforms that you're using, particularly useful if you're sending email, for example. And I reiterate again, it's important, never ever choose a password that is rated less than strong, and we've talked about why. Okay, so basically when we convert passwords into keys, basically we want to say, okay, we've chosen some strong password, and then we want to translate it using the mechanisms that we used for encoding messages or for encoding passwords into something else that translates into some key. This can be some letters that we have or some number, for example, usually, as we saw when we looked at how we decide to generate, for example, public keys. And then we can use these passwords to protect, for example, the traffic that we have from our computing device transmitting itself over the internet to other computing devices. For example, also transmitting files and encrypting, for example, email. There are tools that you can use. So for example, for Mac operating systems users, this is if you have an Apple computer, for example, you can download on the App Store or the applications environment some little software tool that is called GPGP tools, okay, and it will allow you to transform your password automatically into some key that is then used to encrypt all messages that you send off, for example, from your email. And if you're using, for example, Windows systems, you can use GP for browsers, which is basically some variant of generating keys from your password that is a part of what is OpenPGP. You don't need to worry about this. These are basically just tools that allow you to translate your password into some key that allows you to perform some encryption on the systems that you're using. And the encryption is useful if you're wanting to transmit secure messages, or if you're wanting to encrypt files, for example, if you downloaded, for example, TrueCrypt, or for example, BitLocker. Okay, so basically when you decide to download any such key management software, what it will do is to require you, for example, to create a passphrase. A passphrase is basically similar to a password, except that you can write in something that is more, has more meaning to, that makes more sense to you. And usually the longer it is, the better. So for example, if you chose to use, for example, I can hear you clearly in 2016, this is better than if you just wrote down, for example, here 2016. And this is important because the shorter it is, the less secure the key that is generated will be. So for example, if it's longer, the more secure it will be. And the reason that this is the case is because if you recall what we talked about in terms of generating public keys, you need a really large number in order to guarantee that the key that you have chosen is secure, because you want to make it as difficult as possible to be factored. And we talked about the fact that if it is factored easily, it means that the person who factors it has in effect the key in order to be able to decrypt the data that you are, the encrypted data that you are storing or that you are transmitting. When this happens, then basically you generate a public key to encrypt your password, and just remember what we talked about in terms of the Caesar ciphers. Okay, So chains of keys are useful, for example, if you have multiple passwords or multiple passphrases. So if you recall what we talked about when we talked about password creation, right? And the fact that we said that if you have, for example, some sentence, you could choose each of the beginning characters in order to make up your password. With the advantage in the case of the encryption or the passphrase mechanism for generating keys is that you don't need to worry about choosing or selecting these letters yourself. The key generation software takes care of this in the background, okay? What you could then do is that you could then vary the types of keys that you want to have. So on top of your passphrase that you have, which would be, for example, the base password that you have. For example, on eBay, you could have E at the beginning of this passphrase and Y at the end, so that it varies the password that you have created or the passphrase that you have created for the different accounts. And we said that we want to make sure that this happens in order to avoid cases in which when one password is discovered, for example, by some malicious user, that the user is able to access all of the possible accounts that you might have, because they are you're basically using the same password for every single one. So basically we want you, or what I'm telling you or encouraging you to do, is to choose different passwords for the different platforms that you have. Okay. So keychains basically in these kinds of software that allow you to generate keys for passphrases are exist to allow you to manage the passwords that you have in some secure way, okay, in order also to allow you to create a trusted circle of friends for communication. So basically, if you're encrypting messages that you're sending to your friends, they know at least that the message is coming from you and that they can trust the message. And if they do the same, then basically you know that the message is coming from them. It's of course not foolproof, but at least you have some better mechanism for protecting the types of messages that you're sharing. Okay. It's also an organized approach to key management and to password selection, because it allows you to have a couple of passphrases, to have them in some particular location, and to publicize if you want it. For example, so for your password, for each password that is translated into some key, some public key is generated, a little bit like the open log that I talked about. So users know that they can send messages to you using this public key, and that this will allow them to send a message to you that is authenticated as coming from them, and that you can decrypt to read using the passphrase that is translated into some key that allows you to unlock the padlock that they have sent to you. We talked about key management in general to talk about how you translate, for example, passphrases into keys, and how these keys allow you then to decrypt or to encrypt messages that you send or that you receive from other users that you're interacting with, that they allow you to form a trusted circle of friends, and that on top of this is a good way of managing your passwords. In the next lecture, I wrap up. I talk to you mainly about the fact that even if you don't use social media platforms, you are creating a digital footprint, and that you need to be careful in any case about the messages that you share, the information that you share, because all of this constitutes information that can be used to build a profile of your behaviors, and that can be used in ways that you had not anticipated.